Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ronald Weich. I'm the Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law, and I'm very proud to welcome you to this second installment of our law school's new webinar series, UB Law in Focus, in which we feature UB Law professors and alumni discussing important legal issues. Last week, we spoke about constitutional issues rising in the COVID-19 pandemic, and this afternoon's webinar is on another especially timely topic: to protect and serve, changing the culture of policing. Now, before I begin to describe today's panel, I want to give you a preview of the next one in this series. Next Thursday, June 18th, we'll be discussing voting rights under threat. Will there be a free and fair election in November? And we have some wonderful panelists for that discussion. So please check it out by following the link on the homepage of the University of Baltimore School of Law website. Now to today's topic. The phrase protect and serve happens to be the motto of the Los Angeles Police Department and has been adopted by other police departments. And it reflects something of an ideal of what we expect from a department. But to some, that aspirational phrase appears increasingly hollow in the aftermath of the shocking death in police custody of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the death of other victims of police brutality elsewhere over many years. So in the next hour, three very knowledgeable and experienced panelists will share their understanding of how we got here, how they understand the culture of policing, and what they think might be done to address the concerns that have triggered protests throughout the country and around the world. I'll ask our panelists to weigh in on ideas for reform, from demilitarization of police departments and banning chokeholds to changing the role of police unions. And we'll speculate about what the future of policing in America might look like. I also want to tell you that this is an interactive session. We look forward to your participation through questions. So please use the Q&A function of your Zoom dashboard. There's also a chat function, and you can chat if you want, but I'll be monitoring the Q&A function. And over the course of the hour, I'll ask questions that you pose there, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Let me introduce our three panelists. First, Professor Michael Higginbotham is the Dean Joseph Curtis Professor of Law at UB, where he teaches constitutional law and race law, the topic on which he has written a casebook. He's also the author of the book Ghosts of Jim Crow, Ending Racism in Post-Racial America. Mike has been on the faculty since 1988, and he served as interim dean. He was my predecessor as dean, and I'm very grateful for all of his counsel in the time that I've been dean. He's also a frequent guest on radio and TV, sharing his expertise on the struggle for civil rights throughout American history. We're also joined by our UB faculty colleague, Amy Dillard. Amy teaches criminal law and criminal procedure at UB. Her scholarly interests include sanity and competency issues, as well as police use of force. And Amy served on several civilian review boards, reviewing excessive force claims against police officers in Baltimore and elsewhere, and I'll ask her to describe that to us. And finally, we have as our guest panelist, Kim Neal, a 1997 graduate of the UB School of Law. And this is a little bit of a reunion because Kim tells us that she had Professor Higginbotham for constitutional law. We're glad to see each other, and we're glad to have Kim back with us. She began her career in municipal government ethics, and then became executive director of the Cincinnati Citizen Complaint Authority. And last fall, after the police shooting and death of Tatiana Jefferson in Fort Worth, Texas, that city held a nationwide search for its first police oversight director, and Kim Neal was chosen for that job, which she started in March of this year. So those are the kinds of topics we will talk about today. And now let's begin with Mike Higginbotham. Mike, you've been thinking about the history of civil rights for a very, very long time. And I want your take on how the current concern about police brutality fits into that broader history. Is this a symptom of racism in America? Is it apart from the history of racism, or is it part of the long story of race in America that you've told in your books and elsewhere?
Thanks, Ron, and welcome to all our UB Law alums from around the world. I want to preface my remarks today by extending condolences to George Floyd's family and his friends. The funeral, as most people know, was today, and I believe he's being buried as we speak. So may George Floyd rest in peace. I grew up in Los Angeles. Ron mentioned the phrase of the LAPD on all of its vehicles, to protect and serve. Los Angeles had the worst community police relationship that I think existed in the country, if not the worst, in the top three. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s in LA. My favorite comedian, Richard Pryor, used to do a monologue where he would open up by talking about the LAPD has a new weapon, a new tactic. He said it's the chokehold. And Pryor would say all of the white people in the audience would be like, what's he talking about, chokehold? All the black people would be, yeah, we understand. We know exactly what he's talking about. And Pryor, in his comedic genius, had a way of identifying the race discrimination that the LAPD was practicing, because it was only using this weapon in black and brown communities, not in white communities. And my own experience, I had a few good experiences with the police growing up, but for the most part, they were very, very negative, very problematic. I was stopped frequently. I suspect probably one of the most frequent individuals stopped and never arrested in LAPD history. Stopped very frequently. I was racially profiled. I was illegally searched, car searched and person searched illegally often. And I had a smiling while black incident. One of the LAPD took out his baton and threatened to knock the smile off of my face simply because I was black and smiling. I mention this because I believe that we are all a product of our experiences as well as our values. And I have a deep commitment to that self-evident truth that all are created equal. But I also understand the reality of America, the reality that it has been and the reality that it is today. And so I am always in conflict. Every day I question the commitment that this country has to those self-evident truths. I say that because, let me answer Ron's question specifically, but I say that because I want everybody to understand where I'm coming from. Bessie Smith, the famous jazz singer, African-American jazz singer from the 1920s, Bessie Smith wrote a song called Dancing in the Rain, and she said, "It's been a long road, baby, but it's got to find an end. So I picked up my bags and I tried it again." I approach what's going on today. I approach this conference. I approach my efforts in terms of racial equality by keeping Bessie Smith's spirit in mind, because it has been a long road. This road goes back to slavery times. I used to watch the Highway Patrol as a TV show in the 60s. The word patrolman goes back to the slave patrols. That's why we call our police officers patrolmen today. It goes back to the slave patrols, where states hired individuals, deputized them to apprehend fugitive slaves, people trying to seek liberty. When you start thinking about racial profiling, it goes back to 1806 in our country. There's a famous case I talk about in my book, Race Law, called Hudgens versus Wright, where the Virginia Supreme Court laid out a racial profile. It said, if you look white, you're entitled to a presumption of freedom. If you look black, you're entitled to a presumption of slavery. And if somebody claims that you're a slave, you have to prove that you're free. It goes through Reconstruction, where we had tremendous violence unleashed. The Ku Klux Klan was formed. Tremendous violence was unleashed against blacks for simply trying to exercise their constitutional rights. We had laws that were passed during the Reconstruction period. That was the first civil rights period, the first civil rights laws. And of course, after Reconstruction ended, there was tremendous violence in terms of lynchings to keep blacks in line, to keep them from not being able to exercise their rights. And there was also, of course, Jim Crow practices. We tried to pass anti-lynching laws, and Congress is embarrassed to this day, because in 1918 and 1928, they couldn't do it. We had Emmett Till's body, an African-American teenager who was lynched and brutalized in the late 50s. His mother wanted the casket to be open so that people could understand what was done to her son and how heinous these lynchings are and how nothing was being done about them. And then in 1968, when Dr. King was killed, my uncle, Judge Leon Higginbotham, was called into the White House by Johnson, and he was appointed vice chair of a commission to try and identify the causes of our racism and violence and to do something about it. And my uncle had to dissent in the commission's final report. He filed a brief dissent on one issue. And the issue was he wanted to say the protesters and the peaceful protesters in the civil rights movement should be given credit for bringing attention to the problems of racism and violence in our society. And he couldn't get 7 other commissioners to go along with that recognition. We then, of course, have had a lot of Black people die at the hands of the police recently.
That's true, but why, can I interrupt to ask, why is this the one incident? I mean, we've had Rodney King, Michael Stewart in New York, many other incidents throughout the country. Why is this the one that's triggered such massive outrage?
I would refer to Langston Hughes, the famous poet, who said, "What happens to a dream deferred?" He says, "Does it sag like a heavy load, or does it simply explode?" And I think when you start to look at what happened over the last 2 weeks, Langston Hughes's words come to mind, because yes, we have had a number of incidents, from Trayvon Martin, when my book Ghosts of Jim Crow came out in 2013, to Eric Garner, to what's happening with George Floyd. We've had a whole lot of people who have been murdered at the hands of the police. But this is the incident that brought everybody's attention. And I simply don't think there's any sort of equation or formula you can figure out.
Yeah.
This is the incident that did it. And I think what's most critical now is that we don't lose sight, because you know what? There have been a lot of other videos that have occurred and nothing was done. This is the time.
There's something about the video. I agree with everything you said about the history and the right to draw the line right from slavery, lynching, Jim Crow to today. But I think there's something so vivid about this video. And one thing that I think shocked so many of us was the almost blasé quality of the officer, Officer Chauvin. He's seen on the video for minutes at a time, 8 minutes and 45 seconds, with his knee on George Floyd's neck, and he appears almost bored. His hands are in his pocket, and he's almost looking at the camera with a sense of impunity. He believes that there'll be no consequence for this act, even as he's captured on film doing it. And that brings me to the question of accountability. We're going to talk about lots of ways to attack this problem, but one is accountability. And one form of accountability is independent oversight. And so I want to bring our other 2 panelists into it. First, Kim Neal. Kim, would you describe to us the role that you played in Cincinnati and that you currently play in Fort Worth as a monitor of those police departments?
So the role that I played in Cincinnati, I was the director of an agency called Citizen Complaint Authority, which was the civilian oversight in Cincinnati. And Cincinnati was unique in that Cincinnati had gone through a civil unrest, sort of what we're going through right now. And it was at the verge of the Department of Justice coming in to implement a consent decree. And so as a response to that, several groups, the United Black Front and several community groups met with the city and met with the police union and the police department to implement a document that is historically known as the collaborative agreement. And so it's something that it's a bit of an anomaly, because so many cities have tried to implement it since and have been unsuccessful. And it really was at a time where the city was under tremendous unrest. And so it was, the idea behind it was to come together and to agree that there needed to be serious reform within the police department, specifically with its use of force policy, which included deadly force.
Did you see progress? Did you see progress in the years that you were working in Cincinnati?
Absolutely, there was progress, and I should say that prior to that, there were 15, within a 6-year period, there were approximately 15 young men of color that had been killed by police officers in Cincinnati, and no one white was killed during that same time period. And so that was what made it so phenomenal within a 6-year time period. And so what instituted that really was, the citizens had had enough. A young man was killed who was unarmed, who was, the police suspected was doing some type of wrongdoing, and in fact he was not. And the police officer thought that the young man had a gun in his hand, and he did not. And so as a result, he was killed at the hands of police, and that ignited a civil unrest in Cincinnati that they said prior to that, there was nothing like it before that until the Rodney King matter. Rodney King matter was the last matter before that one. And so they said it was sort of the same impact. And so in Cincinnati, the collaborative agreement, what it did was it was an agreement with the police department to basically revise the entire use of force policies, procedures, training within the police department, and also hold it accountable, do some data analytics. And the biggest part of that was to create an agency called Citizen Complaint Authority, of which I was the director.
Does that agency continue even that you've left? Is someone in that role now?
It does continue, and it's funny that you asked that because there was just a headline in the paper yesterday, the Cincinnati Enquirer, because like most cities that have implemented civilian oversight over the years, what happens is when there are no major incidents going on, what happens is they take the funding from the civilian oversight agency and it loses its power. And so what has happened over the years in Cincinnati, because there were, every time there's a major incident, funding gets increased to the agency. If there hasn't been a major incident, funding is decreased from the agency. So at the point in which I left, I had spoke to council and the mayor and the elected officials and said the need the CCA had for more staffing because investigations continued. And so there was just a headline yesterday in the Cincinnati Enquirer that quoted me talking about the lack of funding, but also talked about how now they're going to give a CCA, which is the acronym for Citizen Complaint Authority, all the funding that it needs to not only bring back the investigators that have been furloughed, but also to add 2 additional investigators, which is what I was arguing for when I left there in February. And so that's what has happened across the country, that the unfortunate death of Mr. Floyd, I say to everyone, Mr. Floyd did not die in vain, because we have seen such powerful action across the country by community groups. And even, when you have a situation where you have police chiefs coming out and saying to their officers, I have never seen that in my lifetime, where saying to their officers, if you believe that the officer in that video, his actions were proper, then you need to leave this police force right now. I mean, that is just a phenomenal statement across this country. And I do agree with Professor Higginbotham, and I call him Professor Higginbotham because that's how I think of him. And I just want to say that it's amazing he taught me, but he looks younger than me right now. But anyway, it's just amazing to me that the amount of power that Mr. Floyd's death has had across this nation. And the fact that now everyone's talking civilian oversight. Everybody's talking about what civilian oversight can do for their city.
Well, people are talking about that and lots of other remedies. We're going to talk about a remedy that's gotten a lot of attention in the last 24, 48 hours, which is should we defund the police? But before we get to that, I want to bring Amy Dillard into the conversation on the topic of accountability and oversight, civilian oversight. Amy, tell us about your experiences in Baltimore and elsewhere looking at situations like this.
I just want to start, though, by saying I do not think that we can ignore the power of these amateur cell phone videos. We have only been carrying video cameras in our pockets for less than a decade. And it's easy to forget that we now just have this available to videotape our children or anything that we see on the street. And I say that because in the fall of 2018, when I taught race, crime, and media, I had my 30 students collect and archive and catalog these videos. And we collected over, and there were 100 more to find. And a lot of the most famous ones from the last 5 years or so are in that collection. But I told my students when we started watching these videos, and before I would play one, I would say, you are going to be changed. When you watch this video, you will not be the same person afterwards. You cannot watch Walter Scott shot in the back in North Charleston and fall to the ground and come away thinking the same, feeling the same way. And I think that is true of watching this George Floyd video. I certainly think it's true from watching the Eric Garner video, which is, for many people, the first of the I Can't Breathe videos. But Tyrone West in Baltimore was killed by the police in July of 2013. So he's killed a year before Eric Garner is killed in New York. And he is another I can't breathe case, right? He is another case where police are arresting him. There's some resistance to an arrest that arguably was unconstitutional and unlawful. And multiple police officers are called to the scene. And it's a melee, right? It's lots of officers trying to subdue one man and using every bit of force that they can to do it, rather than any other tactic. And I say this as a parent of a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. If you think that force is going to solve the problem, you haven't parented yet. Because at some point you cannot, force won't get you there. You can't pick them up anymore. And what we read in the officers' reports in the Tyrone West case is very much what we now have all seen in the videos in Eric Garner and George Floyd and in other cases, which is an increase of violence, an effort to subdue, a not being willing to try another approach, a not being willing to recognize, and I'll go back to Walter Scott, that Walter Scott might have run away from the police officer in his traffic stop with his expired tags. But anybody who's watched that video can probably reach the conclusion that he wasn't going to get away. He was a lumbering 50-year-old plus man, not going to be physically fit enough to get away and harm anyone. What we found in Tyrone West when we reviewed that for the police commissioner is that we found that the police had certainly made terrible errors, tactical errors, that aggravated the situation that could have been handled a different way, that they did not follow basic procedures in use of force. But we were left with a coroner's report, much like we see already, I think, in George Floyd, where we see this contribution of factors that lead to death. And anybody who's taken torts or who's taken criminal law with me knows, we do causation analysis. And in these cases where there seem to be multiple causes, it can confuse a jury and create reasonable doubt as to what the cause of death was. And we reached the conclusion, based on coroner assessment and our own, that the excessive use of force could not be pinpointed at that beyond a reasonable doubt spot to be the cause of death.
So your review panel made a series of recommendations. Is it your impression that those recommendations were adopted?
I've always said, and everybody on that panel said, we always thought we were asked the wrong question, because we were so interested in why was Tyrone West even being stopped? Why was Tyrone West being subdued at the time he was? Is that the right use of the resources? That we made recommendations for force training. We made recommendations for tactical training and decision making, de-escalation. We made recommendations for training for just the basic procedures and how to accomplish an arrest of a citizen. And, we made those in 2014. Of course, our recommendations were quickly eclipsed, I think, because the Baltimore Police Department arrested Freddie Gray, and he was killed in police custody as well.
Right. So then the question is this, Kim tells us that she's seen progress in Cincinnati, but certainly it's slow progress at best if you look at cities across the country. And the question is, what other kinds of accountability might we look to? So one is the criminal justice system. Should the officers be charged with crimes and held accountable as other citizens are under the criminal law? Is that a realistic way to attain justice here? Mike, do you think that we should be relying on the criminal law for accountability?
Well, I think accountability is so important. And I agree with Amy that, when you see some of these videos, you can't help but be moved. But I'm also concerned that we've had videos in the past and things have not been done. So when you start thinking about accountability, yes, we not only have to have criminal laws, but we also have to have civil liability. And there's a whole lot of reforms that need to take place in order for that to get done. So I agree, we need both. We need accountability on the criminal side, but also we need liability so that people can bring lawsuits.
Stop for a second on criminal, and let me ask Amy, who knows this subject well. It's really hard to convict a police officer, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't happen so often.
Well, in these cases where self-defense or defense of others is the claim, right? So in these cases where it's a force question and how much force was needed to subdue someone that was being arrested, there are structural challenges. Namely, the Supreme Court has set a different standard for how we review police officer conduct when police officers claim self-defense or defense of others, and how juries should review that for all the rest of us. And by framing the question or framing the self-defense claim for police officers, by looking through the lens of how would a reasonable police officer have acted in this situation, it creates, I think, a difficult jury instruction, and it makes it hard for juries when they hear evidence from other police officers. Well, I would have done this the same way. My training is that I should have done this. I think it makes it hard for juries to return guilty verdicts. Even in Walter Scott, we see a hung jury first, and then we see a conviction. And remember, that's a shooting in the back with a police officer who moves a taser and lies about whether Walter Scott had taken his taser from him. So you had a couple of issues there and a video, right? So you've got an officer lying to say he felt a risk of danger to himself and others because he said Walter Scott had taken his taser and he lied about that, and a shooting in the back of an over 50 man who was lumbering away. Even with that, which I think was really overwhelming evidence, jury hung the first time and came back the second with a conviction.
Kim Neal, in the jurisdictions in which you've worked, what's the thing hanging over the officers' heads that'll make a difference? Is it criminal liability? Is it the possibility of damages against the police department that causes the department to tighten up the policies? Where do you see the pressure points? Oh, you're muted, Kim. Unmute yourself.
So that's questions for me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it's the liability against the police department, and ultimately the city. I think that's the issue for a lot of cities. Some cities pay out a lot of money in settlements and lawsuits as it relates to how a case was handled by a police department. So I think that's the overall reason.
Here in Baltimore, Freddie Gray, the officers were not convicted. 6 were charged, 3 were tried and acquitted by a judge. Against 3 of them, charges were dropped. And then there was a civil judgment that was quite substantial, and maybe that had some impact. But our law professors have alluded to the fact that even civil liability is hard because of the doctrine of qualified immunity, right? Amy, would someone want to tell us about qualified immunity?
Mike, you want to do that one?
Sure. Qualified immunity deals with federal civil rights violations, and what the Supreme Court has a famous case 5-4 decision, where basically the court applied this qualified immunity to police officers in a civil rights lawsuit against them and their behavior. It's going before the court again. And I suspect that we may have a reversal of that decision. It's going up now, and it's a situation where Clarence Thomas and Sonia Sotomayor have both said that qualified immunity may be problematic in these instances. So when you get those two justices saying we agree, I think you're probably going to get a change.
You know, Ron, I'll just say that I think the older I get and the longer I teach law, the more I think that these post hoc remedies aren't always the best method, though. You know, okay, so Tyrone West's family recovered $1 million in that case, and maybe there'll be one for George Floyd. But the fact that people have died and these lawsuits will be the thing that will make changes just seems inadequate to me. Well, it doesn't just seem inadequate to me. It is inadequate. And you know what I think we need to see and how we need to encourage this accountability is not, well, officer, if you continue to sit on George Floyd's neck for another 2 minutes or another 4 minutes or 7 minutes, then you might lose your own home because you might be personally liable for that, or your employer might lose a significant amount of money. I'm just not sure that people, I mean, for all the torts theory that we might spin around here, I'm just not sure that that's what's motivating in the moment when that officer is kneeling on Tyrone West's back or kneeling on George Floyd's back.
Yeah.
I think that what you got to have is other people, you know, colleagues that are standing there, other equals who are standing there, who are willing to intervene and say, get up, get off of him. And we've seen some videos in the last week during protests where we've seen officers be quite aggressive with protesters. And in particular, I've seen a number of Black women police officers intervene and walk the officer who's angry away. And when I see that, I see this is the kind of intervention that you're going to have in the police department, in the unit that's on the street. That level of accountability is where you might actually turn a corner and save lives. And training people to be willing to do that is what matters.
So that goes right to culture. And we're going to talk about some specific reforms, but I want to bring audience questions into this. And there is a question that goes to this question of culture. And I'll direct it to Kim Neal. The audience member says, how long might it take to change poor police culture? How soon can one reasonably expect results? So for example, when would we expect to see the kind of change in the department that Amy Dillard tells us about, where officers are challenging other officers to behave properly? Kim, unmute yourself and give us a sense of how you see the timeline.
I don't think there's any specific answer for that, because I think it depends on the police department. I think it depends on the staffing level of the police department. Is it a small one? Is it a large one? I think it depends on also the tone at the top from the chief and the assistant chiefs. I think that we do have to, I had a conversation with a reporter recently who, because at CCA, we investigated police officers. Here in Fort Worth, we actually monitor police department investigations. And in both aspects, we also implement and recommend policy changes. And so I think where we start with changing the police culture is with changing the policies and procedures of the police departments to ensure that they are citizen friendly. And to what I've read from a lot of police departments policies as it relates to use of force is they start out automatically assuming that the citizen is resisting arrest. They don't start out basically promoting within the police officer that their job is to protect and serve. Their job is not to use deadly force if they don't have to. It should be, it should be the last resort. And so we start there. We also have to ensure that through training and practices that is taught. And so if we don't impact the training, we can change policy all day long, but if we don't change the training that goes along with that policy, then the officers are going to continue to do what they do. And so when Amy talks about the duty to intervene, what we're seeing across the country right now as a result of Mr. Floyd's death is that police departments are visiting that policy of the duty to intervene. Most police departments have that policy. It's just not something that they rely on a lot, because you have that brotherhood, sisterhood thing within the police department, where if you tell on another officer, and you have the body-worn cameras now that's getting all the information. And so if you call an officer out right there on the scene, let's say you're a junior officer and that's a senior officer, there's a whole culture change that we have to do. So there's no concrete answer as to the timeline. It just depends on really.
Does the change happen from the bottom to the top, or the top to the bottom? And you mentioned police department leadership, and we have four-minded commissioners and chiefs. Is that where the change starts?
I think the change starts at the top. I think you have to basically, at a chief level, an assistant chief level, and the assistant chiefs are going to be over those divisions, and specifically there's always going to be assistant chief over the patrol division, which is generally the officers that get in this type of trouble. That it has to be a tone at the top where we're not going to tolerate it. So when you see these chiefs coming out saying to the officers that if you think that that officer in that video did the right thing by Mr. Floyd, then you need to leave. That sets the tone right there for the department. And so that should trickle down. And then you have to hold your staff, your patrol staff, your middle supervisors accountable from that point on. And you have to make it a part of performance reviews. You have to, a lot of times police departments grapple with this whole idea of promotions, because promotions are generally done by testing, and you're not looking at basically the record of an officer. And so a lot of chiefs are trying to visit that idea, but then it implicates the union, and the unions get involved because they want it to be done by testing versus by an officer's record. And so all of these things are things that need to be changed within the culture of policing, and that's going to take some time.
Yeah. Mike, there's a federal bill now, the House of Representatives, Democratic leadership there has a bill to kind of impose federal standards, a federal prohibition on chokeholds, federal ban on racial profiling, federal database to prevent officers from moving from one department to another after discipline. Are you comfortable with that bill? Does that seem like it goes far enough?
I'm very comfortable with it, and I'd like to see more, quite frankly. As you mentioned, stop racial profiling, stop the chokehold. I mean, I thought the chokehold had been banned by the Supreme Court. I had to go back and look at the case, and I was like, wow, this is the worst case ever. Another 5-4 decision again, right? And of course, we need to have a federal database of bad cops, because they leave one department, they go to some other jurisdiction. So yes, we got to do all that, and we've got to do more. As Kim alluded to, when you start changing some of the practices and policies, then it has an impact. And so we've got to pass some laws here that will start changing that stuff. We got to stop the police bill of rights that, you can't fire bad police officers. I mean, we've got to change a whole lot of things. And the federal government providing guidelines and passing some laws is a great start.
Now, one way the federal government has been, I think, distinctly unhelpful is the federal government was providing military equipment to departments around the country, surplus military equipment. Amy, you have a sense of how that has changed police departments?
Well, I have, I'm sitting in Bloomington, Indiana, a sleepy little college town, where one of the debates right now is whether or not the Humvee that was given to the police department needs to be in use or not, or needs to be sold. Just get rid of it. We do not need to have this kind of military Jeep equipment in a place like this. So you see some pushback on that. I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I think that it's easy for us to pay a lot of attention to how to police and how to train and punish police officers, but we're doing that all in an executive branch, right? And we have to remember that the police have been empowered by all the laws that have been passed that they've been charged with enforcing, right? So for Eric Garner, it was don't sell loose cigarettes. And for George Floyd, it was using a counterfeit bill. And for Tyrone West, it was making a turn after allegedly not coming to a complete stop. you know, if you watch a video of a woman named Natasha McKenna, who was killed in police custody in Fairfax County, she was in custody and being moved from one cell to another cell. And the video cameras in the jail recorded 10 officers trying to move one woman, small woman, who said, "You promised you wouldn't kill me," before they did kill her, moving her from one cell to another. When I watched that, I find myself going, what was so important about moving her from cell number 1 to cell number 2? What was so important about not selling the loose cigarette, the nuisance of Eric Garner sitting out front and selling the loose cigarette, allegedly, that it needed to result in this level of violence? And so I think we have to have some accountability. Stephen Carter wrote the piece today about, you know, we just have way too many laws. We've criminalized lots of activity that didn't need to be criminal. I think about the amount of time I spent as a public defender defending people charged with distribution of fake cocaine, right, in the war on drugs, distribution of soap powder, right, fraud cases, if anything. But, you know, when we think back to Congress abolishing parole in 1987 and setting mandatory guidelines and how we view this war on drugs and what police officers were charged with doing, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, police officers and units were charged with getting in there and investigating and using special spotting scopes and having special cars jump outs, right, into communities and arresting a lot of people all at once. You know, I think the Supreme Court is responsible. The Supreme Court created a free search doctrine in 1968 with Terry versus Ohio. And that free search doctrine has been expanded and expanded in police departments and expanded by the court in the 52 years since. Every case that arrives in the breach, the court seems to say, well, that one was fine too.
So we've talked about lots of different reforms and accountability measures, but the issue that's gotten a lot of attention in the recent days, and it shows up in our audience questions, is about defunding the police. Are the changes and reforms that we've talked about so incremental as to be insufficient and so slow as to be too frustrating? And do we need to take more dramatic action? So I'd like each of you to address this question about defunding the police. What does it mean to you? And does it seem like a sound concept? Mike, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think that's the most important aspect, too, of the discussion, is to define what you mean by defunding the police. Because a lot of people are saying, oh, that means eliminate the police. And I don't think it really does. So first thing is be clear about what you mean in terms of defunding the police. Does it mean elimination or does it mean something else? You know, basically reinvestment of funds, or you know, does it mean additional options when you call 911 rather than just have the police show up? Or does it mean taking money from departments that don't change, don't deliver, don't readjust to our new requirements? So be clear about what you mean by defunding. And I can be very supportive if it's about reinvestment or changing departments. To me, that makes sense. But to eliminate the police, I don't think is sound.
And you've seen, I'm sorry, let me turn to Kim. You've seen police departments up close, day to day, working with departments. Do you think they need more money to create, you know, better training and so forth? Or should they be stripped of resources to divert to, you know, mental health and substance abuse and other kinds of services? Unmute yourself, Kim.
I don't think they need necessarily additional funding, but I do think they need to consider when they have these funds and they're going to impact community programs, that they include the community in the decisions on how those funds should be used. I think that defunding the police, of course, as the professor stated, is something that unless somebody defines it, then, you know, we're just unsure what that means. But you clearly cannot not have some type of law and order in our society. I do think, though, that some of that funding can go to social programs, like you said, mental health. Autism has become a big issue now, and how police officers deal with autistic citizens. And so I think community members, really what community members want is that they want to be able to communicate and collaborate with police officers. to ensure that they're addressing the community needs in which they serve. They don't want to be policed, they want to be served. And I think sometimes that message gets lost, and not necessarily with an entire department, but of course it's with the personnel within that department.
Amy, how do you see defunding the police? What does it mean to you?
I'm probably going to be more radical than the rest of y'all.
That's okay.
So I think that what Minneapolis has done by doing something, right, and a lot of this is branding, right, political branding in terms of how we label this. But I think the idea that we need to step back and really examine what police departments are doing, right? I mean, Tracy Mears wrote this just yesterday in an Atlantic piece. What are police departments doing? And I think once you begin to understand that they're playing a lot of roles, right? I mean, there's no doubt they're doing investigation and preparation for prosecution, right? They're doing that kind of work. And, you know, and when we think about violent crime, we might think about the importance of that in our community. They're doing a lot of intervention work, right? Where somebody calls and says, I've got neighbors who are a nuisance. I've got a car just sped past me and almost ran over my kid. I've got a child who is very difficult to manage. I have a spouse who has gotten violent in this moment. I see a neighbor who's experiencing a mental crisis, right? These are intervention roles that the police are playing. And I think what we've seen over and over is the police are not very good at that, at least when we're watching these videos, right? So where the police need to be de-escalating, they specifically seem to have been trained to not be able to access the ability to de-escalate some of these difficult situations. But I think that enforcement is really where the game is. You know, where a police officer is out and driving a car and sees someone change from the right to the left lane without a turn signal and pulls that person over. Now, is that proper? Is that proper enforcement of a traffic ordinance? Probably, right? It's there. The choice to do that, though, is, I think, less rooted in the enforcement of teaching someone the lesson of not using the turn signal, and more for the free search that often comes with it. And maybe we'll find that someone's in possession of drugs or in possession of a handgun or has a warrant out for them for some other reason. And it's those enforcement ways, some of which are really de minimis enforcements, that I think rile up the kind of resistance that we see from the over-policed in our community, right?
Well, especially if it's racially, if it's over-enforcement that's racially based, if people are being pulled over.
You know, I just don't think I'm going to be stopped that often for sitting on a park bench after dark right now.
I got you. Let me jump to a question from the audience. Good question. What role do you feel police unions, fraternal organizations, and benevolent associations play in this crisis? Can they be part of the solution, or will they be a hindrance? Kim, have you seen, I don't know, in Cincinnati or Fort Worth, the police unions be constructive, or are they an obstacle?
They can be both. They can be constructive. You can have, and a lot of times that's the tone at the top. That's the president who's leading the police union. So if the president of that union feels that the police department is willing to sit down at the table and collaborate on issues that affect the community and police, so that there's a better understanding and the relationships are better between the two, then it can be a great relationship. If not, and the police union president is one in which he or she constantly wants to make excuses for police officers and their use of force, then that can be a whole different set of issues. And then I've seen police unions also, it depends on how proactive they are and how viable they are. I've seen police unions where the majority of the active membership are just retirees. And those retirees tend to be from the old school train of thought of policing. And so therefore they don't think that there's anything wrong with policing, versus the new school train of thought. If you have more active officers in the union, which you're going to have a more diverse group of folks, then they're going to generally hold their union and their union elected officials accountable. So it's a full spectrum across the country, and I think it really depends on who that union represents actively and who that union president is for the most part.
You know, on the audience questions, our colleague Walter Schwadetsky is watching. Hello, Walter. Good to see you. And he asked an interesting question that I'll direct to Mike Higginbotham. He says, these incidents occur in cities with Democratic mayors. And given the party's longstanding support of civil rights, Walter would have expected Democratic mayors to be more aggressive, proactive in reforming police departments. Why has this not happened? Why are we waiting for incidents? So, Baltimore City has had aggressive Democratic mayors for years, and yet it took, Freddie Gray and the Justice Department coming in with the consent decree before there was a real effort at reform. Why aren't progressive mayors taking steps in the first instance?
I think it's very hard to change the police. I think we've already mentioned a number of policies and practices that prevent even a very committed mayor from doing so. In Los Angeles, the police were protected from reform by politically elected individuals. So when Tom Bradley was elected mayor in Los Angeles, they thought, hey, he was going to make some changes. But the police had protection. The police had barriers against political elected officials being able to institute reforms. And I think you've seen that throughout the country. You look at employment contracts that the police unions have provided for police officers. Even when they mess up, they can't be dismissed.
Interesting. We also see, the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, was very close to police unions and police organizations. And now I think he's repositioned himself as something of a police reformer. And that's a reflection of the times, I would say. Another question. Are you familiar, or any of the panelists familiar with MPTC training's use of force continuum? I'm not sure, MPTC, which force that is. They're trained from simple command presence to lethal force. Is that something that concept of a use of force continuum, is that part of the use of force policies that you have utilized, Kim, in your work?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I believe in the use of force continuum, and we've seen full spectrum of departments. Some departments promote the use of force continuum, but in their policies and procedures, they don't define what it means, and they don't define the different levels of force. Of course, with the most serious force being the deadly force, and so I'm a strong advocate of actually outlining that in the policies and procedures. But not only that, also ensuring that the officers understand that ultimately their responsibility is to use the least amount of force as possible, and it should only be elevated when they feel like their lives or other lives are in jeopardy. And so that's a very, very important concept that needs to be defined further in a lot of the police department's use of force procedures.
Question from the audience. Does the Second Amendment, and I'll just kind of rephrase this to say, does the proliferation of guns on the streets of America affect the way police do their job? They're under the threat of constantly running into somebody with a gun, or the threat of a suspect taking a police officer's gun. Does that create a nervousness, a paranoia among police? Amy, is it your impression that police are kind of on edge because they know that there are so many guns out there?
Well, whether they're on edge or not, they're always held to the same reviewing standard, which is, can they point to objective factors to show that a reasonable police officer would have felt an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death? And so we've seen these cases where, Philando Castile maybe the most famous, where he's literally saying to the officer, I have a gun, I'm allowed to have a gun, and I'm going to get it for you. But what else could he do? Or I'm losing some names now, and I apologize for that. But men who are standing in backyards talking on cell phones, and police officers immediately think that, or testify, or in the investigation say they thought that was a gun. I think we have to be able to assess, whether that was a reasonable conclusion that justifies the use of deadly force in those cases. And again, to go back to this continuum, is it the only thing you could do in that minute? We have a doctrine in self-defense, which is that you need to retreat before you start to use deadly force. Of course, that doesn't apply to police officers. And so, but, should they be trained that what you need to do in this de-escalation or this, a choice of the force to use is to step back before going into use force, see if there's a way to retreat and use other police tactics in order to investigate what seems to be a scary situation without going in guns blazing.
Which I think goes to this question of, do the police officers see themselves as warriors or guardians? Are they trying to keep the peace, or are they, kind of an occupying force in these neighborhoods? Which raises for me the question of residence. Should police officers be required to live in the cities that they're policing? Would that be helpful, Mike, do you think?
I think it absolutely would be, and I think that it's crazy that we don't require police to come from our communities. I mean, to me, that doesn't make sense. And the argument, that, that encourages graft or something like that, I think is just a bogus one. And what we need is police officers living in the communities that know people, that know who's doing the crime, that know who are good people. To me, that makes sense. And that's what we need to do. And I think we also have to understand that when the police view themselves as an occupying force, and if they live in Pennsylvania or other states when they're police officers in Baltimore City, they're going to view with suspicion those who are of a different color. And so to me, we're avoiding that issue, which is a real problem, that when white officers stop blacks, they have a certain suspicion that the black person is bad or that the black person is doing wrong, and they have a certain fear. And that causes tremendous problems of use of force, and that use of force continuum.
Which takes us back to your history about how this is linear from
Yes, it does.
de jure discrimination and slavery and Jim Crow, and here we are today. All right, we have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you to kind of give us your final thoughts. And in the framework of this question, is the moment that is going to lead to fundamental change. We've seen, each of the panelists has observed that there are many examples in the past of excessive force by law enforcement officers. Sometimes it's led to incremental change in individual cities, but it hasn't been kind of across the board, across the nation change. So starting with Kim, and then Amy, and then Mike, tell us how you see this moment playing out. Are we going to be a different society in 6 months or a year because of the death of George Floyd? Kim?
I think we absolutely are going to be a different society. I think the key, and I think one of the questions that was asked is, how do we see ourselves in 6 months, a year from now, and how can folks make a difference? And I think that you always have to continue to hold your government officials accountable. I think, and I'm not just talking about the police department, I'm talking about me as the police monitor for Fort Worth, and the government officials in any city government, local government, federal government, state government. You have to continue to hold folks accountable when it comes to this issue. And make sure that you play an active role, not an inactive role, where not until something happens do you then want to have dialogue. You have to constantly be a part of your community, and you have to constantly weigh in on issues that concern you, but also give the community accolades when they're doing a good job. Give the government, give the police department accolades when they're doing a good job as well. It takes an entire village to work on these issues, and it's going to take an entire village to ensure that all of the things that come out of this remain sustainable.
Thanks, Kim. Amy, how optimistic are you about the possibility of fundamental change?
I don't think anything's going to happen fast, and I think it's going to take a lot of work. And I think that we are lazy in our pragmatic incrementalism in a lot of ways with policing and tinkering around the edges. And I hear in the political conversation a lot of things being suggested and change and reform that have been part of the conversation for many, many years. None of this is new language. I'm sure it's not new language to Kim, right? She's been studying this long. Michael, it's not new to me. I'm glad that it is, that other people are learning, that other people who are voting are going to learn about this. I really think we have to listen to the people who are over-policed. And so that Mike began with his story about being in LA and what his experience was as a young Black man being stopped by the police. I think we have to hear those stories, and we have to believe them. And I think there's been long skepticism in the broad white community to think that that's the truth, that it hasn't been exaggerated. As a public defender, I used to hear those stories, and I used to raise constitutional challenges to those arrests. So I've been hearing them for 30 years, but a lot of people have not been hearing them. and we need to listen, and we need to believe, and we need to hear more of them.
Mike, I want to slightly reframe it for you. Obviously, I want to hear whether you think we're going to make fundamental change in law enforcement, but more generally, is this a moment to advance civil rights? Ted Kennedy used to say civil rights is the unfinished business of America. Are we finally going to finish the job?
Ron, I so hope so. I so hope so. I'm eternally optimistic that we're going to, in fact, make fundamental changes. But I've been disappointed in the past. And when we think about videos, we've had other videos, we've had other protests. So a word of caution. I hope this will be a moment for fundamental change. We've got to make sure that not only do we focus on the absence of violence, but we also have to focus on the presence of justice. That means not only charging the officers that murdered George Floyd, but also convicting and sentencing them to appropriate sentences. But in addition, change our society, fundamentally change our society with new laws, policies, and practices.
Thanks. Well, it's quite a moment in this long struggle that Mike has outlined for us and that Amy and Kim have helped us understand. So I thank all of you in the audience for being with us for this hour as we talk about the culture of policing. We didn't get around to all of your questions. I apologize for that, but we did our best. And I very much appreciate our panelists for helping to illuminate these vitally important issues. Thank you very much, Kim Neal, Mike Higginbotham, and Amy Dillard. Please join us next week, next Thursday, when we will talk about voting rights in America, and we'll find out whether we're going to have a fair election on November 3rd. Thank you all very much, and have a safe night.